Welcome to In Plain English, a podcast where we discuss scientific research in terms that are accessible to everyone, not just the experts. I'm your host, Jamie Moffa. Before we get started, a few quick reminders. First, if you are able to, please consider becoming a patron of In Plain English. You can find our show on Patreon at Plain English Sci. That's PLAINENGLISHSCI. When you join, you'll get some special perks available only to patrons, such as early access to episodes, bonus content, and monthly AMAs. But don't worry, the main show will always be free and open access. Supporting us on Patreon will help the show in so many ways. With enough backers, I plan to upgrade my audio equipment, commission a musician to make new intro and outro music, and pay for transcriptions for all of our previous episodes and all the episodes going forward. So, if you are able to, please consider becoming a patron of In Plain English. Second, In Plain English now has a Discord server. In the server, you can connect with other fans of the show, discuss past episodes, chat with previous guests and experts, and more. Having a place where everyone can interact, ask questions, and share ideas is part of how I imagine the future of science and science education, so I'm really excited to see all of the conversations and ideas this space can create. The link to join the Discord server is in the episode description. Come check it out. As always, you can download the paper for each episode at inplainenglishpod.org by clicking on the episodes link in the main menu. We believe in open access science for all, so the papers we choose will always be free for you to download. If you have a question or comment about a previous article, you can either join our Discord server or you can submit it under the Continue the Conversation tab. If you are interested in being a guest or presenter for a future episode, you can click on the Become a Guest tab on the website. You can reach out to us on Facebook or Twitter at Plain English Sci, and subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. With all of that out of the way, on to today's paper. On today's episode, we'll be talking about cap-and-trade policies, specifically California's policy that was implemented in 2013. We'll be discussing this using the paper Leakage from Subnational Climate Policy, The Case of California's Cap-and-Trade Program by Justin Caron et al. Presenting this topic is our expert guest and my sister, Kelly-Anne Moffa. Kelly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. So I'm Kelly-Anne. I'm currently a Master's of Public Policy student at the University of Southern California. Previously, I was at the University of Connecticut, where I got my bachelor's in economics as well as my bachelor's in environmental studies. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Kelly. And joining her for this discussion are our two guests for the episode, Leenah Abugisisa and Alexander Albury. Leenah, Alex, would you each like to briefly introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Leenah Abugisisa. I am a neonatologist, which is a baby doctor, and I happen to know your host from the outside normal world, and that's how I made it on here.
Hi, I'm Alex Albury. I'm a PhD student at Concordia University in Montreal in psychology, and I have an entirely psych background, but my current research is on music cognition and how we learn to play an instrument.
Great. So without further ado, Kelly, take it away.
Sure. So I decided to choose this paper because I find cap and trade very fascinating, as well as any type of policy that is aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I thought that we could start by giving a brief overview of what cap and trade is, because I take it for granted as something that I just know like the back of my hand. But so cap and trade is a market-based instrument that is designed to internalize the cost of externalities such as pollution, which is what this paper focuses on. And so basically, instead of directly telling entities like manufacturing factories or businesses how much they have to reduce their emissions by, which is called command and control, this sets up a market so that businesses have the flexibility to reduce the pollutants by however much they're able to. So what happens is firms are given allowances. Normally they purchase them at an auction, and those allowances or the permits or allowances for pollutants sum up to the total amount of pollutants that a government wants to be emitted. So that's called the cap. And then they're allowed to trade those allowances once they've bought them. And that basically creates a market and a price for emissions that were not previously priced in the supply chain or in their products that they're selling. So it's a way of internalizing the external costs of pollutants. This has a lot of benefits. It allows for more flexibility in meeting emissions reductions. It gives firms that have the capacity to reduce their emissions a lot extra profit because they're able to sell their permits or their allowances. And then those who cannot reduce their emissions have to pay for them. And then the auction that the initial permits are sold at is revenue for the government. So it ends up being pretty beneficial for everyone. So some previous really prominent examples of cap and trade systems were the acid rain program back in like the 70s, 80s, 90s. And that was for sulfur oxides, and it was really effective in reducing the amount of SO2 that was in the atmosphere. There's also the European Union cap and trade, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, which I actually did my senior thesis on at University of Connecticut. And then, yeah, there's California's cap and trade program, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So the paper talks a lot about how the California cap and trade program was designed, and then one of the biggest issues that happens with all climate policies is leakage, which is what this paper focuses on. And leakage happens when a climate policy, specifically this one is looking at greenhouse gases, when those policies are implemented, they can cause other areas that are not under the regulation to increase their emissions because either through trade, the regulated region will start buying more goods from unregulated regions because of price changes. Fossil fuel prices also decrease because there's less of a demand from the regulated region. So that causes unregulated regions to use more fossil fuels. And then there are also some other issues relating to trade. So that's what the paper focuses on. Did anyone have any questions about the basic setup of cap and trade policies or what leakage means?
I was wondering a little bit if you could clarify basically what you were just saying in terms of the different types of leakage. They specify between like you said, trade leakage and then fossil fuel costs, and I wasn't entirely sure I understood the differences between the two versus and also I assume like just direct energy like electricity transfer.
The impacts on trade, which is one of the biggest areas that leakage occurs, that can be, yes, from the electricity market. So if a regulated region has a lot of electricity that they source from, say, carbon intensive fuels, either natural gas or coal or oil, and they can't use that anymore because it becomes a lot more expensive, then they'll import their electricity. And if they don't have import tariffs on their energy, then that will increase the emissions from other regions. But then also, I think in the paper, they talk a lot about rubber production and other just manufacturing industries. Manufacturing can be very carbon intensive. So if an area that is now under regulation has something like a cap and trade policy, and their manufacturing firms now have to pay for their emissions that they're producing, their end products will become more expensive. So people may start to shift towards buying other imported goods from areas that maybe don't have those regulations and would be cheaper. So that's the aspect of trade that leads to leakage for climate policies. And then fossil fuel prices is a little bit different. So because an area like California has these regulations on having to pay for their carbon dioxide emissions, they will be trying to use less fuels that produce carbon dioxide emissions. So basic tenet of economics is supply and demand. So when demand goes down, prices will go down because suppliers are trying to induce people to use it. So in other areas of the country, because California is such a large market, they can have an impact on national prices of fossil fuels. So when they stop using a certain fuel, the price could go down because coal suppliers or oil suppliers are losing some of that revenue, and that would induce other areas of the country that are not under regulation to increase their energy consumption because the price of their fuels just went down. So why not use more? And so that gets into one of the biggest topics that the paper goes over, is how this leakage is impacting the effectiveness of California's cap and trade policy. They are trying to measure whether or not a certain aspect of the California cap and trade policy, which is these tariffs on imported electricity, are beneficial in reducing the amount of leakage that happens. So, as I was just saying, when areas implement regulations that are trying to decrease the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from certain sectors, the prices will change. Specifically, prices would probably increase in the regulated sector, and that's what happened definitely with electricity in California. And importing electricity from other areas that are not being regulated. So take importing electricity from other states or from Canada that could be cheaper, could have a very negative impact on the goals of the program, because the greenhouse gas emissions that would have been emitted in California are just being shifted to being emitted from other states. So what California attempted to do was set up kind of a border carbon adjustment tax. So for any electricity that entities within California imported, they would have to give up some of their permits or allowances that they bought at the initial auction for the cap and trade program in order to cover the emissions that were produced from their imported electricity. And that got really tricky, and there were actually lots of changes. So that was how the program was initially designed, was that you would have to, know where your imported electricity is coming from, how it was produced, and then give up permits for the amount of carbon dioxide that was emitted. But that's something that would have been very hard to track, and especially with making sure that the place where you got your electricity from isn't doing this thing called resource shuffling, which is when firms that are producing electricity or power plants that are producing electricity know that perhaps they're selling their electricity to California, so they're going to sell them the clean energy, so the energy that was made from renewable sources or from nuclear. And then they move all of their energy that was produced with dirty fuels like coal or oil or natural gas. They'll sell them to other regions that don't have those types of regulations, so that resource shuffling can also mitigate the impact that California's cap and trade program would have on actually reducing emissions, because they're trying to get away with still emitting all those pollutants and just not paying for it. And the way that California's cap and trade program was initially set up, they would have to make sure that power plants that are producing electricity outside of the state of California aren't doing this resource shuffling. And as you can imagine, that introduces a lot of legal issues. And so before the cap and trade program actually began in 2013, there was a lot of restructuring of how that import tariff would work for importing electricity, and whether or not you would have to disclose where you get your electricity from or where the source is from, and whether or not there was resource shuffling that occurred. Before all of the changes to the policy, you would have to attest that there wasn't any resource shuffling and sign like a legal agreement, and utility companies and power plants all had big issues with that. So it started kind of a legal fight in California. And so they got rid of a lot of those regulations because they wanted to just get the cap and trade program up and running.
I find it kind of interesting that, the state of California kind of requiring some degree of honesty and transparency regarding what the source of the electricity that they were getting just caused so many legal issues. You would think that if you didn't have anything to hide, you wouldn't have any issues with just disclosing where the energy was coming from or what sources were used to generate it.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes you think that, oh yeah, people are trying to get around these regulations because they don't want to disclose where they're getting their electricity from. And that's definitely to be expected. I mean, businesses are going to try to do things in the least costly way possible. And if that means getting their electricity from dirty sources, then that's what they have to do. Yeah, so you definitely can see the unfortunate habit of businesses to try and go smallest cost as possible.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the beginning of this the way the cap and trade program is set up. What are the repercussions for, like, I guess, entities that don't follow those rules? Is it, and would it be, I guess, the supply companies inside California? Would the suppliers in other states be able to be affected, or does this only affect companies that are in the state of California?
So it only affects companies that are within the state of California. They have to have these allowances for the cap and trade program, and they have to have the number of allowances that equates to the tons of carbon dioxide that they emit in a given year. California's cap and trade program is linked to the cap and trade program in Quebec, or in Montreal. So they have a joint auction, and then they can trade permits between companies in California and then in Montreal. So I guess it also covers those companies. But yeah, so it's just companies, and the paper discusses what types of industries are covered by the program. So it initially had only covered firms or power plants that generate electricity, but then it was expanded to cover like transportation and other just any other entity that uses fuels. That covered manufacturing as well, and agriculture, and they all have to report their emissions as well. And so that's how the state of California and the California Air Resources Board can monitor, okay, you had this many allowances, you emitted this much. You either have to pay and buy more allowances, or you get a fine. So that's the way that they kind of enforce this policy. And then in order to decrease emissions overall, so the goal of the cap and trade policy is to decrease greenhouse gas emissions over time. So what the state of California does is they decrease the number of allowances available, and they increase the price of those allowances. So that has led to a decline in California's greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the Senate bill was proposed in like 2009, and it was passed in the legislature in like 2011, and then it went into effect in 2013. And the goal of the program was to decrease greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. And they actually met this goal in 2016. So they were very ahead of the curve, and they have further reduced their emissions since. So they're on their way to meeting the next goal, which is 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and then 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. So those are the future goals of the program. Anyways, yes, so firms have to have the right number of allowances to cover the number of emissions that they report having in a year. So it's just for California and Montreal, and they have fines to make sure that people are actually adhering to these policies.
Right, and I guess the external suppliers also have an indirect financial interest, because I saw too that in some cases, if say and who they call exporters, say another state from California, they don't have the alternatives to supply California, they end up just sending less energy to California overall. So
Mm-hmm.
they sell less electricity. So they may not, I guess, have direct like legal repercussions the same way that California companies do, but they have
Mm-hmm.
a financial interest to increase like renewable or clean energy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they do.
The one thing that does strike me about that, though, is that this is all for exporters. This is all going to be retrospective. So, like, it's going to be after the energy has been produced already and after the greenhouse gas emissions have already happened by the time, electricity is exported to California. And so it's kind of, it feels like it wouldn't necessarily be as punitive, because if the electricity has already been exported, then and the associated greenhouse gas emissions have already happened, then it's more of a, oh, you shouldn't have done that. because legally, I can't think of a way that the state of California could enforce anything from a legal standpoint.
And I think that also would tie back to the longevity of the program. So this has been going on almost 10 years now. And there's this history of, okay, you got this electricity from non-renewable sources, you have to pay this extra money. And having that happen year over year, these exporters from places outside of California, they learn either to shift their electricity supply to more renewable sources, or they just stop selling to California. So that is what encourages that shift overall. And it goes to, this is going to keep happening year over year. So it's beneficial for places inside California to start sourcing their electricity from more renewable sources, and then making sure that whatever they're importing is also coming from renewable sources.
Yeah, no, it does address kind of the point that even if initially, there is some increase in emissions, that the goal is to, gradually curtail that.
Yeah, so kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of the paper, it does get pretty math heavy in the middle, but generally what the authors are doing, they use a general equilibrium model, which is looking at how supply and demand acts in an economy when there are many different markets that are all interacting with one another. And the model figures out basically when the economy will reach equilibrium prices. So when the supply is equivalent to the demand. The authors gathered a lot of trade data both from inside the US and outside the US. I think they looked at 15 states or regions in the US and then 15 countries and regions outside of the US to look at the flow of goods and the flow of energy to and from California. They used various different statistical methods to make the data all equivalent with each other, and then also reconcile estimates with actual observed data, bring everything into the same base year so that all of the data was comparable. And then they put all of that into the general equilibrium model in order to figure out what's going to happen when these prices change. So what's going to happen with all the different trade flows, either for goods or for energy, and see where the production of these different goods or energy is going to increase, where it's going to decrease, what happens in California. And that's how they end up measuring the leakage rate. So whether or not production increases in a certain area gave the authors insight into whether that was in a regulated area or outside of a regulated area. And they were also able to look at, the mix of energy that is generally used to either produce goods or produce electricity, and how much CO2 emissions that would generate. So after all that math in the middle, they come to their results about the different scenarios that they considered to figure out leakage rates based on different prices and interactions between the California cap and trade and the European Union cap and trade, as well as the Montreal one, and then different configurations of the actual California cap and trade policy. And they also make, I like to talk about in economic papers, there's always a lot of assumptions that are made with economic models. And I think that assumptions they are very critical to economic models. You can't look at everything in as much detail as anyone would like to, but assumptions, I think, get economists in trouble a lot for people who are not economists, because they are like, oh, why are you making that assumption? That seems totally unrealistic. So I did just want to go over the assumptions right now, put them all out in the open. So some of the big ones that they make amidst all of their linear algebra in the middle was that they assume that firms get constant returns to scale. So that means that like a unit increase in the inputs leads to a unit increase in the outputs. So the graph would be like a straight line going upwards. And they assume that for all industries except for fossil fuel industry, agriculture industry, and renewable electricity. And they assume that that has decreasing returns to scale, which means that the output is only a fraction of the input. They also assume that everything is operating in a perfectly competitive market, which is, everyone knows, economists know, this is not realistic assumption. Nothing is a perfectly competitive market except at like a really fine micro scale, maybe. So they make that assumption. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. And other assumptions are about, how production inputs move across sectors and about regions. So assuming like that labor, so people who are working for these firms can't just instantaneously move to a different state. If prices increase and they lose their jobs, they're not going to immediately move to another place. So they make some assumptions about how quickly labor and capital and other inputs will move to a different sector or move to a different region. And then they also make assumptions about how electricity is substituted for other generating fuels. And I thought this was an interesting assumption that they made, but they assumed that there would be no expansion of nuclear power in the US, which is a pretty hot topic right now in the energy world, as especially in California, as they're trying to meet their goals of like 100% renewable energy by 2045. And they're also considering closing down a nuclear power plant right now. So everyone's talking about, well, how are we going to get to zero emission energy when we don't have nuclear because we don't have the capacity? So I thought that was a really interesting assumption that they made in their paper. But I just wanted to lay out all those assumptions because they're important to note that they're in there. So this is not looking at a real-time picture of the world that it is. It's looking at a very simplified model of the world in order to try and get a measure on what would happen or what is happening with this cap and trade policy.
Yeah, I think it'll be, entirely impossible to have a 100% accurate set of predictions. If economists could do that, wow, you know what? I think from, things that are kind of like a really hotly contested issue, kind of like nuclear energy, I think it makes sense to kind of be like, well, let's assume nothing changes there because that adds too many or too much uncertainty to any model. While in the real world, I kind of agree that that may not necessarily be what happens, but from a mindset of here are some other, or just coming from a very different area where we also have a lot of uncertainty, it's like, well, the biggest things that would change too much and would really throw everything off completely, let's kind of leave those alone for now and just work with what we have and kind of modify what we kind of can calculate or, predict within a reasonable degree of certainty.
Yeah, definitely. One of the first things that you go over in econ classes, like Econ 101, is talking about assumptions and why they're necessary. And one of my professors always pulled up this map of like the London Underground. And there's like the map that they put on the underground that's just like, the straight lines that show where all the stops are and kind of generally where that is in the city. And then he would pull up an actual like map of the London Underground showing like how all of it curves and twists and just intersects with one another and like how cluttered it is. And we would go through and talk about all the different assumptions and generalizations that are made in like the easy to understand map of the underground. And he would relate that to economic assumptions, is that you still get the important information out of the very simplified map. You don't need all of that extraneous information to pull out the big picture. But obviously, once you get off the underground, you need to know where you are in the city. So the assumptions are important, but you also have to know that that simplified model isn't giving you an accurate picture of the real world. With those assumptions and all of the modeling that these authors did, I thought they got some really interesting results about leakage. And so going over kind of the various scenarios that they looked at for their models, they had their baseline scenario, which was just looking at the European Union cap and trade system, because that system has been around for even longer than California's kind of the baseline. So they were looking at how much leakage came from that, and that's what they were comparing all of their results to. And so then the next scenario that they looked at that wasn't the baseline was adding in the California cap and trade system, but looking at it when there was no tariff on imported electricity. So no, like, you don't have to give up your allowances for importing electricity. You don't have to know where it's coming from or the emissions that are coming from it. That was the first scenario that they looked at. And then they looked at two different scenarios with a tariff on imported electricity. So looking at, first of all, if there was resource shuffling, so that exporters of electricity from outside of California could reconfigure their energy exports so that they're only sending the clean energy to California, but they can keep producing all of the dirty electricity that they want and just send it to elsewhere where there wouldn't be any fines associated with that dirty electricity. And then the third scenario was looking at, yes, there's a tariff on imported electricity, and we are able to control for resource shuffling. So exporters of electricity outside of California cannot reconfigure their electricity supply so that they can get away with like only sending the clean energy to California. From these scenarios, so they found that in the scenario where there is no tariff on imported electricity, 45% of the emissions reductions from the cap and trade system were leaked. So 45% of the emissions reductions were still emitted elsewhere. So that really negates a lot of what California might be seeing as, this is how much we're reducing our emissions. Actually, 45% of it was still emitted elsewhere. So that's a really high leakage rate. And then they actually found in the scenario where there was a tariff on imported electricity, but there was resource shuffling that occurred, there would actually be there is a slightly higher leakage rate. So it was 46% of emissions reductions were emitted elsewhere through leakage. So it really showed that the authors really showed that if you cannot control for that resource shuffling, it's basically as if you don't have an import tariff at all on that electricity. It was the same amount of leakage rates without the electricity tariff and with the tariff, but with resource shuffling. And that's in really stark contrast to the results that they got for the leakage with an import tariff and being able to control for that resource shuffling. The leakage rate was only 9% of emissions reduction. So it was a really low leakage rate when you were able to control for that resource shuffling that occurs with electricity exporters outside of California. So I thought those results were really interesting.
The whole thing with resource shuffling to me is like very reminiscent of, we're not dumping waste in our waterways, we're just dumping them somewhere else. That kind of energy, so to speak. It is very disturbing that you can have very, very strong laws and protections, and have them, or environmental, I should say, protections, and have them completely or almost completely negated by your neighboring states kind of going like, okay, well, I guess if you don't see what I'm doing over here, level of action. I mean, environmental issues are one of those few things where what your neighbors do is as almost as important as what you do, because it's kind of the same planet and it's the same atmosphere that we're all dumping greenhouse gases into. Like, there's no way of being like, okay, so we cut them here, which means we're going to benefit and other people are going to be stuck with. That doesn't cut it, unfortunately. Yes, obviously there are always local and regional benefits for things that happen locally and regionally, but overall, the effects don't materialize unless there is a bigger buy-in throughout.
Yeah, and that's one of the unfortunate things that you learn over and over again in all of the environmental classes that I've taken and the environmental economics classes that I've taken, especially, is that climate change is such a large problem. And yeah, it doesn't care where you draw your fake border lines. Like, it doesn't care that, oh, but California, we're being really good and reducing all these emissions. Like, it doesn't matter. There are still plenty of emissions being produced elsewhere, and it's going to make the climate worse and continue to warm and have more severe storms. And nothing will really be effective unless you get a large amount of buy-in from a large number of countries, especially the countries that do emit a lot. Because yeah, if you have one person being really good and reducing their emissions a lot, if their neighboring country or even neighboring state is still producing a lot, then yeah, it's not really going to make that big of a difference. So that's something that I've actually been talking a lot about in my classes this semester, is how to deal with that. And the solution that one of my classes focused on a lot was something of a border carbon adjustment. So very similar to this import tariff on electricity that's imported from other places outside of California. And it's essentially, yeah, supposed to punish regions or countries that are not reducing their emissions by putting a tariff on where the goods that they're trying to sell to the regulated area or the regulated country. And it's, supposed to signal to that country that your economy is going to suffer if you don't start reducing emissions. And it works great in theory. Like, the logic of it makes sense, but it's the implementation where you really need a large actor that has a lot of influence to make that change. And you would think California would be that type of large actor. They have a massive gross domestic product that is as big as some countries, bigger than some countries. But because they're just a state, and there are 49 other states and international regions that are competing with goods from California and can sell their electricity elsewhere, it wasn't big enough to make that impact and start inspiring and encouraging other places in the US to adopt a cap and trade. And there were obviously legal reasons because, there's kind of supposed to be free trade between states. So putting a tariff on electricity imported to one state versus another brought about a lot of, yeah, legal issues and just fights about what trade is supposed to be among states. So it's why it didn't really work out at the subnational level. But at the national level, it's certainly easier to implement tariffs.
This makes me wonder if something similar but implemented over, or like like a region, multiple states kind of have a similar program that they all kind of follow the same regulations. And also, I think this is one of the few laws that I feel like there hasn't been much of a snowball effect where like a lot of other states kind of start doing this once they see that there is a lot of success. I mean, just from how ahead of the timeline California has been, and California, like you said, massive state, lots of production, lots of population, lots of consumption. You'd think that other states would say, "Oh, okay, if this works somewhere that is very populous and has a lot of economic things going on, then perhaps this could work in other places too." And there really hasn't been anything similar popping anywhere else. And I don't know, it's kind of surprising, but potentially if there was like an entire region, like, or at least several states that kind of set a similar program for themselves and kind of start actually propagating that, then there might be gradually, as more and more states or groups of states started doing the same, there might be more of an effect.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And there is, so in the Northeast region, I think it's like Virginia up, basically, there is a regional cap and trade program. So it's all of New England and New York and Maryland and Delaware, New Jersey, and Virginia recently joined. And that's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And that came into being about the same time as the California cap and trade. But obviously, it's a lot smaller of a area, even with all those states in it, still a lot smaller than California. And there were attempts to make a kind of regional cap and trade program when this California cap and trade program was being designed back in like the 2010 time. There was a organization called like the Western Climate Initiative, I think. They talk about it briefly in the paper, but it was a organization of a bunch of different western states in the US, so all of like Pacific Northwest, California, I think Idaho was also a part of it, and then British Columbia and some Canadian states. They had all joined this organization and were intending to make a large regional cap and trade program, but I think it was formed just shortly before the Great Recession. And obviously, that kind of threw a lot of stuff off, and governments became very focused on just the immediate issue at hand. And regrettably, I think that happens a lot with climate policy, is it very, very easily gets pushed to the back burner when something bigger happens. So before COVID's happened, there was, lots of global movements for more climate action. And then COVID happened and it got pushed to the back burner. And it's happened repetitively. And because it's an issue that's so long term that is not, immediately on your doorstep, that it's very easy to just keep pushing off. So I hope that more places start to see the benefits of having a cap and trade program and see that California is still doing great while reducing their emissions. So they should join on board, or there should be more movement at the national level, because there is only so much that states can do, and for a small state that might not have tons of emissions, they may not see the need to be part of something bigger, and that can become the issue of everyone says like, oh, it's not my problem, it's someone else's problem, it's that state's problem, it's that country's problem, so I shouldn't do this thing. So that's where you also need a higher level of organization and government to step in and say, no, we're all going to do this, because we're all part of the problem and everyone has to be part of the solution too. That's where I would like to see cap and trade policies headed, is at a regional or national or international scale, because that's how you just make it more beneficial to be a part of it and really less beneficial to not be a part of it, to encourage everyone to take action.
Yeah, I'm wondering in terms of enticing other states to do it. I'm thinking of states and people in general are usually more self-interested. So I'm wondering if, based on how the California program is set up, does California does it generate revenue for California with the whole trading of credits and things like that? I'm just thinking of, like I said, being America being what it is and the states being like focused on themselves. I'm trying to think of like almost greedy way to get people to buy into this.
No, that is my favorite thing to think about. That is why I started studying economics, was how do I convince people to care about the environment in terms that they understand, which is money always money is money talks. Money gets people to do things. So yes, the cap and trade program does generate revenue for California with the auctions that they hold each year to sell that year's permits to the different firms. It generates revenue, and all of the money in California that is generated from the cap and trade program, it goes into California's greenhouse gas reduction fund. And so all of that money is earmarked for further reductions in air pollution and investments in things like green infrastructure. So building more rail lines, investing in electric car chargers, improvements for power plants and electricity generating facilities. That's where most of the money goes. And then they also have a stipulation in the bill that created the cap and trade program that 25% of those funds also have to go towards investments in environmental justice communities. So areas that are low income or historically minority communities, they often face the most detrimental impacts of climate change. So 25% of the funds generated by the cap and trade program have to go to investments in those communities to mitigate those impacts. Yeah, the cap and trade program it generates money for the state, which is something that all states need. All states need money. Everyone seems short on cash. So that is one of the benefits. And I know of a few other programs. So in British Columbia, in Canada, they have their own carbon tax, so slightly different from a cap and trade program. But the revenue that's generated from that carbon tax that everyone has to pay is redistributed back to the population through lower income taxes, which is something that might not be entirely feasible in the US just because there's a lot more bureaucracy and separation of government organizations and government entities. So it makes it a lot harder to do that cross collaboration of, well, the EPA is raising this money, so the organization that runs the income tax gets that money and they can lower all the income taxes. Other areas, so other California and then other places that have implemented these types of carbon pricing instruments have generated revenue from it and seen real benefits for their citizens and to their communities. But I think it's more of a issue of getting other states to buy into that, because the immediate thing that they see is this is a tax on our manufacturing. This is a tax on our industries that is going to hurt us. So it's a matter of framing and showing them that, no, actually, this is going to be beneficial for your state. This can raise revenue for your state. And if you become a part of something bigger that everyone else is becoming a part of, you won't then have to pay these import tariffs for everything that you're generating.
Sorry, I was just going to say, ultimately, that is going to be the only way to kind of get enough states to actually commit to it, is saying, well, guess what? Everyone else is doing it. All the cool kids are doing it.
Peer pressure.
I can't think of any other way, honestly, because the problem is there are so many issues that, need to be urgently solved in the short term. And funny enough, a lot of them are things that did not, were not taken care of in the long term and were just pushed aside until they became critical. And the problem is that environmental issues are not in the category of we'll eventually be able to fix it if it breaks, because if it breaks, that's kind of the planet breaking. And it's unfortunate that we kind of, instead of using some common sense to fix the issue, kind of have to find financial motivation for states to kind of and hopefully eventually countries to actually commit to not letting greenhouse gas emissions, push the planet into full chaos mode. The other thing, or that might be something that needs to become more mainstream, is the concept of minimizing manufacturing and production overall by decreasing consumption, because the less power that manufacturing industries have, the easier it is for legislation, whether that is on the state or national or even local level, to be less beholden to these industries when drafting laws and working on any sort of thing that might affect them negatively but would be beneficial environmentally.
Yeah, that decreasing consumption is going to be a very important factor in addressing climate change, and it's also going to be the most difficult one to encourage.
It's almost un-American.
It's very un-American, and it's just, it's not something that you can really regulate through policy. You can't make a law that says, I mean, you could make a law, but no one would like it or pass it, that says, like, you have to stop using electricity for 5 hours a day and you can only buy 4 items of clothing in a month or in a year, and try to decrease consumption. Trying to decrease consumption through policy will never work.
I think it might work through like a really, really broad, like grassroots movement / campaign, educational campaign.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that I feel like I've been learning about since I was in like 3rd grade, is like you reduce first and then you reuse and then you recycle. So like the order to the triangle of recycling is meaningful, and it's something that part of it is really just there has to be a culture shift. There has to be an underlying like societal movement towards just general caring about the environment, and yeah, reducing consumption and reducing energy usage in order to really get a large amount of change. And there's a debate in the environmental world that I think is kind of a silly debate. And it's engineers versus wizards. But it's basically like, are we going to try and like solve our way out of this issue and like keep advancing technology and keep like improving our cars and improving our manufacturing methods so that like we don't have to change, but we won't be producing all these emissions? So all of these technological advances, or do we try to like the wizard side of it, I think, is like actually trying to change how you act and really trying to get people to care about the environment and like reduce their consumption and reduce how much energy they use. And I think it's a silly debate. I don't think it's either or. I think it's, you have to do absolutely everything you possibly can to tackle this problem. So sure, make all of those technological advancements. We need them. We're going to need them on the adaptation side. We need them on the mitigation side. Like, do all of that. But at the same time, don't believe that technology is going to save you. And you also have to address the root cause of all of these issues, which is just overconsumption and overuse of all of our natural resources. In the financial climate world, there's a lot of talk right now with the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission. I think that's what that stands for. But they're deciding on a ruling about whether or not to make climate-related disclosures mandatory for public companies. And that's been an underlying movement in the past like 10, 20 years in finance related to climate change, is one, convincing businesses that climate change is going to hurt you in the end. You think it's all great, you're burning all this oil and coal right now and your business is booming, but in 10 years when you're being constantly flooded because of sea level rise, or severe storms are just constantly destroying your facilities, or your supply chain is completely disrupted because of drought and wildfires, like this is going to hurt you in the long run. That has been something that's gaining a lot of traction in the business world, is looking at how your business is going to be impacted by climate change, and then in conjunction how your business is impacting climate change. I think that's something that could have a big impact on how the world shifts away from overconsumption, as if you make the businesses realize that they just can't keep rapidly consuming all of the natural resources, because in the end it's going to destroy them. Like, it would be essentially self-destruction. That's a way that you could start to see shifts in society. I don't know how the discussion about climate related disclosures will go with the SEC. I don't know if they will enact their ruling, but I think it would be very interesting to see. And then it would also make it a lot easier to take that step towards a national cap and trade program, bringing it back to the paper, because then you would have companies across the country required to disclose how many greenhouse gases they're emitting in a year. So you would then have that information and have a system in place at least to do monitoring. And that's half the battle, is being able to monitor these entities that are emitting greenhouse gases. And then the next step is creating a market for it and charging them for the emissions that they are producing.
And the truth of the matter is that so much of it is industrial. So, like, one of the biggest things is, or one of the biggest greenhouse gas emissions are due to methane, which, because of massive amounts of, well, I don't want to call it's not really farming because it's so industrialized. Unless that is under some degree of control, things don't necessarily improve. And so there's kind of this very weird space between telling people that you need to do everything that you can, while also knowing that what matters is a lot of change on the industrial level, because individual contributions, obviously every little bit helps, but they're not going to have as much of an effect, which in the end, kind of starts demoralizing people. But even though it's really supposed to do the other, to go the other way and motivate people to put pressure on, whichever industries are in their locality, in their state, to try to become more environmentally responsible, which, again, we all know it's possible, we all know it's doable. It's just not profitable, which is why it never happens.
Yeah, it's something that you have to remind yourself that really, regardless of what you do on an individual level, you have to keep in mind that the purpose of making all those individual changes is to try and encourage a higher level of change, and to be pushing for a higher level of change at industry level, at the government level. It's good to do all of those things yourself, and every little bit helps, and it helps to shift the mindset around sustainability and to make it more part of our everyday lives, and a normal thing to be conscious of how your individual actions impact the planet. But it is not going to solve climate change. One last thing is carbon offsets, which I have it's not even a love-hate relationship. It's kind of a hate semi-like relationship, because they are very much something that I think is used in greenwashing a lot. And there was another paper that I was reading related to this paper. Unfortunately, it was not open source, but it was talking a lot about resource shuffling and more of the legal issues behind the California cap and trade. And that paper was talking about how resource shuffling and carbon offsets are the greatest threats surrounding greenhouse gas abatement. There was a study that had been done that showed that actual greenhouse gas emissions, so not the net greenhouse gas emissions, but the actual greenhouse gas emissions increased when carbon offsets are included in like the models for the cap and trade system in California. So there was a pretty big story last year about one of the utility companies in California purchased carbon offsets from a area in California that had actually been destroyed by a wildfire 2 years ago. So there was no carbon offsetting that was being done. All of the trees were gone, but they were still counting it as a place for carbon offsets because it had trees 2 years ago. I don't know if you all know much about carbon offsets.
I actually don't, and I was going to ask you to kind of expound upon that a little bit.
Yeah, so what carbon offsets are is there are ecosystems and certain entities that are carbon sinks. So they take carbon dioxide out of the air and they store it. So trees are a very good example. They, through photosynthesis and whatnot, they take in carbon dioxide and they store it in their biomass. The ocean is another carbon sink and it absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide. The soil is also a carbon sink. So there are a new part of the fight against climate change is nature-based solutions, and carbon offsets are a big part of that, is just promoting that there are things that can be done to take carbon out of the atmosphere. They are, I believe, part of the California cap and trade program now as of, I want to say 2017, but I'm not sure on that, so don't quote me. But so instead of buying allowances, you can say I bought these carbon offsets so that the carbon that I emitted was absorbed by these trees. Therefore, I don't need to have an allowance to cover that amount of emissions that I produced. But where it gets tricky is an issue with double counting. So you have to make sure that like 5 power plants aren't purchasing carbon offsets from the same forest because there's only a certain amount that trees can, a certain amount of carbon dioxide that trees can absorb. And then there's also the issue of those trees would have existed and absorbed the CO2 anyways. So unless you are investing in like planting new trees or restoring forests, you're really not actually mitigating the CO2 that you are emitting. You're just kind of saying like, oh, well, we didn't technically like count for the fact that this is going to be absorbed by a tree, so now we are, and we can keep doing what we're doing and not actually change. So those are the issues with carbon offsets. There's a way that it could be done if you had a lot of monitoring and a centralized system where you like knew where all of the carbon offsets were coming from, that they were still viable sources of carbon offsets, meaning they weren't destroyed by a wildfire 2 years ago, that they're actually new and wouldn't have just been doing that anyways, regardless of whether or not someone was emitting that carbon or not. Then yes, sure, they are technically offsetting the carbon that's being emitted into the air, but I think the state of it right now is it's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of shady business.
There are more issues with carbon offsets. One, even in cases where companies do carbon offsetting by planting new trees, oftentimes they plant like monocrop trees that are not actually native to that region, and also plant like, first of all, those trees aren't absorbing the amount of carbon that a like tree would if it had like always been there, because they're baby and need to grow. But two, they're planning on cutting them down, or some companies planning on cutting them down as like wood eventually. So it's kind of an investment and not really like a carbon offsetting thing. And the other one is that sometimes companies buy carbon offsets by buying like land to be put in nature reserves in places where people are living.
Green colonizing.
I mean, the white colonizing was bad enough. Can we just like not just redo it with different colors?
So Alex, I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts on the carbon offsetting conversation before we kind of leave that?
No, I am surprised that I didn't know about all those flaws with carbon offsetting because I sort of knew the general idea that you pay money to offset your carbon, but then logically you assume that it goes somewhere meaningful and actually does the offsetting.
I wanted to end on something hopeful. This is not necessarily directly connected to a question that's directly connected to the paper, but just like, what is something in the realm of like climate change, climate justice, that sort of area that you're like hopeful about?
I'm really happy to see that Los Angeles is putting a lot of investment into their public transportation. So there are 2 lines that are new that are being built for their metro rail system for their trams, and 3 of them are being expanded. I really like to see that they are really investing in that, and then also investigating ways to reduce driving in the city. So I mentioned earlier that I work for a transportation research center at USC, and they're doing a lot of work right now to look at road use charges. So basically tolls charging you for how far you drive. I really like to see that it's gaining ground and momentum to move away from being such a car city to being more of a walkable public transit city.
So, Kansas City has had free public transit for about the past couple of years. It's one of those things that, you would expect somewhere that was more, like a larger or more quote unquote liberal city or region to have established something like that. But the fact that it is something in a relatively heterogeneous, both population and politically speaking, plain Jane Midwestern city is one of the things that makes me hopeful that if we can start replicating that model in a lot of cities, then that we can have some forward motion in at least solving one of the many, many, many puzzle pieces that affect or that have a lot of effect on on climate change and on environmental issues.
In Montreal, there's I'm not even sure as long as I've been here, which hasn't been that long, but the buses are hybrid, but they recently introduced brand new all electric buses, which is sort of cool. They're very fancy, very futuristic looking, very new. And so that's one great thing. And in general, I think sort of like Leenah said, it's just nice to see a really great public transit system. Montreal's pretty good in terms of like getting around, and so it's sort of at least a good example that shows what can happen.
I guess I'll close with something that I am hopeful about is just that at least sort of what I've seen locally is that more people are aware of even small scale things like how bad grass is for the like local ecosystem, and planting different kinds of like native pollinator plants in your lawn, people having gardens or community gardens where they can like grow some of their own food and share that with others. I think, yeah, just a lot of these, obviously, like we were talking about, we need much bigger changes than just these small scale changes to make an impact, but also the more that like more local communities can have self-sufficiency in more areas is also going to reduce the amount that you need to like buy apples that have been shipped from halfway across the country and generated a lot of greenhouse gases. On those actually hopeful notes, thank you all for joining us for the 9th episode of In Plain English. We have been discussing the paper Leakage from Subnational Climate Policy, the Case of California's Cap and Trade Program by Justin Caron et al. We have been discussing this with our expert, Kelly-Anne Moffa, and our guests, Leenah Abugisisa and Alex Albury. And you can download the paper for free on our website at inplainenglishpod.org. Make sure to subscribe to In Plain English on Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening, and tune in next month for another episode of In Plain English.